Welcome to the third event of the ongoing Athens Security Forum, organized by IDIS, the Institute of International Relations, here in Athens, and supported by NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and the Athens office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. The Athens Security Forum is also organized under the auspices of the City of Athens. My name is Alexander Cooley. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and I have the privilege of being your moderator tonight. Having discussed in the previous two events the emerging geopolitical realities that NATO's new strategic concept must address, and then the future of transatlantic relations after the Ukraine war, now we turn to the most pressing question in the current situation. And we will be discussing the challenges that the EU, NATO, and the international community will confront in dealing with Ukraine and Russia following the war. NATO has been implicated in this war in many different ways. There are from debates about NATO's role and the question of NATO expansion to the very real decision to expand membership in NATO as a consequence, in part, of the war, with Sweden and Finland submitting their applications, to the whole question of what types of security guarantees the international community will be able to provide, and whether that will be part of a possible peace process sometime in the future. To this effect, we have an extraordinary panel of distinguished experts, both here in Athens and remote. But we will start with our remote speakers, Volodymyr Dubovic and Paula Redondo. Volodymyr Dubovic is director of the Center for International Studies at Odessa, Mechnikov National University. Volodya, the floor is yours, but perhaps you can just tell us just a little bit, what's the mood like now in Odessa? What's the situation? Again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your insights with us today.
Hello, thank you. Thank you, Alex. Let me start by saying thank you to everyone and all organizations who were involved in putting this event together. I think it's a wonderful series of events by our Greek colleagues, obviously, but everyone else who pitched in, being Konrad Adenauer Foundation, NATO PDD, and others, obviously Harriman Institute. Thank you very much for this. And it's a great privilege to be moderated by a good old friend, Alex Cooley. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. I'm closely monitoring situation in Odessa, even though I'm not there. I am in Western Ukraine, as many of us are these days. I moved out some time ago, a long time ago, basically, because I thought that the Russian advance on the city and potential occupation is a very real possibility. That wasn't the chance that I was willing to take, and that's why I moved out to a little town in the Lviv region in Western Ukraine, where I am joining the ranks of millions and millions of internally displaced persons. I was wondering as a scholar for years what this actually means, IDPs, and now I know what it means because I'm one of those. Yeah, I'm actually not in this situation where I'm kind of, in a difficult, in a need, in dire straits. But I'm seeing around me a lot of people who are actually in dire straits, and they are basically left by themselves, and that's a difficult situation. In terms of Odessa, it's still tense. As you know, it was spared the most vicious violence that we saw in many other places, like Mariupol and Kharkiv and some other places. For some reason, and we still try to speculate about what were the reasons why Odessa was spared, why the aggressor was so gentle to some extent with Odessa. There have been some hits on Odessa, obviously, mostly missile hits in recent weeks. They intensified somewhat, but mostly still against infrastructure, be it facilities like factories, plants, oil refineries, railroads, infrastructure, bridges, and stuff like that. So primarily not to hit the city, but to prevent the flow of supply, military supply, and stuff like that. So that's what's going on in Odessa, for instance. What's going on with the war, I'm sure this audience knows really well. I'm Most of the times I'm speaking about this in the roundtables like the one we're having today, but today is a different topic. So let me go straight to some of the points I would like to make in terms of this moment for the West, for the entire international community. Obviously, this is, to me, a critical juncture for the entire world, but definitely for the West, whatever that means, and we'll explore that. It's a crossroad. I mean, you can take a number of roads. I mean, it's definitely not predestined. It's not like you're doomed to walk a certain road. No, there are many paths ahead, and you can choose one. We would actually be a wake-up call. I think it is a wake-up call what Russia is doing to Ukraine right now for the last 3 months. Actually, yes, tomorrow is going to be 3 months exactly of the start of the war. But what you can do with a wake-up call or alarm call, it calls you to wake up, but you might keep on sleeping, or you might heed it and actually do something about it, but not something systemic, so to speak. I mean, to continue this parallel, you can go quickly to the restroom and come back to your bed and continue with your sleeping. So what do? Do you actually do something about that wake-up call if you're the West, or you ignore it, or at some your own risk? Are we going to see the revival or some kind of reinvention of the West? What is it? I mean, we've been talking about this for years now. The 2014, actually, the start of this aggression have given a chance to start thinking about it. But apparently, as we now see, not everyone, far from everyone in the West, understood that moment, 2014, as a wake-up call. So it was a lot of the same old, all the same kind of politics and policies and so on. So the whole idea of collective West, I wonder now, will we see it? We don't have the answers for all these questions right now. Is it going to be a reality or is it going to be fiction? What is collective West? Is it a slogan, or is it something that will actually appear, emerge, and stay together? I mean, the main issue right now is to stay together. Can we see the collective West acting through months and many months and maybe years of this, not just the first 3 months? Because we're seeing the signs of both, of some disintegration of this unity and actually some of the surprising scale of the unity. I personally was surprised. I didn't think the West would be able to be staying so focused so far. Another thing is interesting, of course, is like we always thought about this dichotomy, values versus interests. But right now, I think in many ways you can kind of pay attention to both. What Russia is doing to Ukraine, you need to prevent it from going on. You need to punish them. You need to help Ukraine. You need to restore the international order. And here, I think the values and interests are really meet together. So I think it's a rare chance for the international community in the West specifically to put those two together and not to choose like often before they had to, either values or the interests. Another thing, of course, is hard power is back. It's so massively back. I mean, even after 2014, I was making a lot of presentations and I was saying that hard power is back with vengeance, but comparing to 2014 is nothing, so a little skirmish on the side of the road. So right now, of course, it's a huge conflict, and many were surely not ready for the large-scale conflict. I mean, what we're seeing the military not ready. We're seeing lack of reserves. We're seeing storages quickly depleted, even in the most advanced military powers like US. Basically, Ukrainians got all those Stingers and all those javelins, and nothing left. So you need to think about the military production and making it more quick, because right now it's kind of slow. So therefore, no one was getting ready for the big war. I mean, I guess now they need to be ready for the big war because, well, that's what you have right now, and you might have more of it in the future. I mean, the soft power, of course, is relevant too. So how do you counter this subversive narratives that Russia is using, or China is helping them in many ways? How you advance your own? I mean, how do you battle the territories that are contested between, let's say, Beijing, Moscow on one hand, and then the West, so to speak, on the other hand? How do you block a certain segment when you know that they're lying? It's a new thing there. Even a few years ago, for instance, when Ukrainian government was putting out of work some certain media sources and outlets in Ukraine, there was mostly criticism from the West. In the recent years, nothing of the sort. And that's interesting because actually people have learned what this fake reality alternative facts people can do, what kind of damage they can do to your society, and that people in the West learn about that. And that's why I think there's this change of attitude when Ukraine is trying to do something about those channels and TV media outlets and so on that are basically distorting reality. And what do you do? I mean, so the soft power is very much relevant. It's just what do you do with it? Then, of course, the future of realpolitik, of course, now the voices of, giving Ukraine to Russia somehow at some point, better quicker than later, because, well, why drag on the conflict and so on. This discussion will go on forever, whatever happens to this war in Ukraine in the coming months and years. But in terms of the future of realpolitik as a view, do you subscribe to it? Then what do you do? Where do you draw the line? For instance, now the Russians, in the middle of December, they said it's not just about Ukraine, it's about Baltics, it's about all those countries that joined NATO after 1997, so 96, 97. So should you actually give them the entire Central Eastern Europe that they would claim, maybe, or Baltics, or just Baltics, or maybe Romania, but how about Bulgaria? So, I mean, how much land are you willing to give? Or, on the contrary, how about some kind of offensive realism, meaning you go on offensive, meaning you say, you know what, all these lands I've just mentioned, including Ukraine and Belarus and Moldova, it's not Russia's sphere of influence, it's a West sphere of influence vis-a-vis Russia. And we want and we need and we can claim this area. So how about some offensive realism for a change, and not just a Mearsheimer type when you're gonna give up the territory to the aggressor state thoughtlessly and endlessly. Some final observations here is that we are seeing, and that's going back to the soft power issues, I suppose, and some economic issues too. We're seeing some disconnect with the global south. I mean, you actually have the West consolidated, helping Ukraine, punishing Russia. But the rest of the world is kind of looks at it with some mixed feelings. Some are sitting on the fence, some are neutral, some are actually even having some sympathies for Russia. And so on, a lot of countries say, I mean, we don't understand that war, like who is right, who is wrong there. We don't want to be part of it, and we don't want to be dragged into this. So it's similar to the old Cold War, but the bigger issues, of course, issue here and the question here is like, we have a new Cold War to start with, because if you listen to the rhetoric,
What's happened? There is a problem with his connection. What problem with his connections? Okay. Do we have Paul? We have Paul on? Okay. Hopefully we'll get Volodymyr. He was reaching the end of his comments, so hopefully we can get him back. But Paula, if you're there, why don't we move on to you and your opening remarks. And Paula Redondo Alvarez Palencia is the program officer for Russia and Central Asia at the NATO Public Diplomacy Division. Paula, thank you again for being here. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone from NATO headquarters in Brussels. And thank you very much to Alexander for the introduction and to EDIS for the invitation. It is a pleasure for me to speak at the Athens forums and to be in the company, even if virtually, of such a distinguished group of panelists and the public. Actually, I hear myself echo, so if someone can mute the microphone from the main. Okay, perfect. Now, sorry. I was going to lose my train of thought very, very quickly. So I was going to say that the topic of the conference is actually very relevant because there has been a lot of focus, and very rightly so, on our response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But what happened after the war has not been as thoroughly discussed, at least in public fora. Of course, the Kremlin's unprovoked and unjustified war against Ukraine has shocked the world, and is precisely for its brutality, for the scale of it, and for its utter disregard for international law and the rules-based international order. It is also creating a humanitarian disaster of enormous proportions, which affects not only Europe, but the security and the stability of the whole world. But before I get into the after the war scenario, I'd like to outline very briefly NATO's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The first pillar of NATO's response have been to protect the security of NATO. It's our number one responsibility, of course, to protect NATO allies. And we do that by using deterrence and defense to send a strong message to Russia and prevent the conflict from escalating beyond Ukraine. For this, as you all know, we have reinforced the eastern flank and established 4 new battle groups. And we were able to react so quickly because we were prepared for it. NATO is, of course, not at war with Russia, and we are not seeking confrontation with Russia. But our strength in deterrence and defense ensure that there is no room for misunderstanding in Moscow about our readiness to protect and defend all allies. And ironically, with this war, President Putin has also achieved what he wanted to avoid: a stronger NATO, more united than ever. And even two countries have applied for membership. The second pillar of our response has been our unprecedented support to Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces are countering the Russian offensive with courage and professionalism. And as they do so, NATO allies and partners are stepping up and providing more support to help Ukraine defend itself. That is a right enshrined in the UN Charter. NATO allies have provided and committed light and heavy military equipment to Ukraine, and we are also providing substantial financial and humanitarian aid. And all of this is making a real difference, and it helps Ukraine to protect its people and defend its territory and its free and democratic future, which is the topic that we want to discuss in this fora. And finally, but not less important, we have also imposed consequences on Russia, be it at the UN, at the OSCE, at the ICC, at the ICJ. We are galvanizing this international support to impose severe cost on Russia, also through sanctions. And we will also work with the rest of the international community to make sure that we hold Russia accountable, or those responsible for violations of human and international law, including war crimes. In addition to this, and before the invasion started, we tried, the international community and NATO in particular, we really tried to engage in genuine and constructive dialogue with the Russian authorities, and we tried to address these issues of common concern and solve our difference through diplomacy. Unfortunately, as we all know now, and we see very clearly, we did not see the same willingness to engage in dialogue from our Russian counterparts, and despite calls from the escalation, Russia launched its brutal attack. For more than 30 years, we tried to develop a partnership with Russia, and the relationship has not always been easy, but we always try to have an open dialogue with the Russian Federation. However, with this brutal war, Russia has broken any trust that was left in this relationship and has fundamentally changed the relationship for the long term. For reference, I'm sure most of the experts in the room know this already, but in the 2010 strategic concept that was adopted in Lisbon, and which is still technically the current one, allies state that they would like to see a true strategic partnership between NATO and Russia. This is obviously not possible anymore, and it's not going to be possible in the short term or the medium term. Our relationship with Russia is right now at the lowest level since the end of the Cold War, and Russia's actions are a direct threat to our security and stability. All these changes, of course, will be reflected in the new strategic concept, without prejudging its outcome, that will be adopted at the Madrid summit in June. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is impacting also a lot the strategic concept. The cooperation and dialogue that we have worked for many years with Russia doesn't exist anymore, as I mentioned, but at the same time, Russia will be still our neighbor, and we will need to manage this difficult relationship. We will need to continue to engage with Russia, as the Secretary General has said, on issues like risk reductions, transparency, deconfliction, and arms control. But I also want to stress what have said before by NATO leadership, that the meaningful dialogue with Russia that we strived for before is not an option anymore. And it's precisely because Russia is blatantly violating international law and using military force against an independent and sovereign nation. I think Volodymyr was going a bit about this in his remarks also, that the Kremlin's ambition with this invasion is to recreate a sphere of influence and deny other countries the right to choose their own path. And here I want to recall the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which, as you know, is the framework of our relationship with Russia. And this Founding Act clearly states our commitment, both NATO and Russia, to respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all states. Of course, Russia has ignored the Founding Act for years with its illegal annexation of Crimea and also today with this full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, and has walked away from its commitment under this document. With Ukraine, our relation after the war and the level of NATO support will also depend on what Ukraine would like this relationship to be. Since 2016 and the NATO summit in Warsaw, NATO's practical support for Ukraine is set out in the comprehensive assistance package, and we continue to support Ukraine within this format. We support Ukraine goals to implement security and defense sector reforms according to NATO standards, and we do also by providing strategic legal advice via the NATO representation in Ukraine and other capacity building programs and trust funds. Bilaterally, many allies and also at the EU are discussing about how to provide support for the reconstruction of Ukraine, so a free and democratic Ukraine can rise up from this brutal war. But of course, before anything can happen, Russia must stop the war. We, as NATO, have called repeatedly on President Putin to stop this war immediately, withdraw his forces from the territory of Ukraine without conditions, and engage in genuine diplomacy. So I just want to close by thanking all of you for your attention and looking forward to listening in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Paula, thank you very much. Do we have Volodymyr back? Perfect. So Volodymyr, we just went to Paula while we got your connection back up.
Sure.
If you were talking about the difference between some of the non-Western reactions and contrasting that with Western unity, relative Western unity as a result of the war,
right,
as an observation that you had.
Yeah, and I'll be concluding because I spoke for enough. But just final points then. Indeed, the way the war is seen somewhere in the global south in most places is different from how it's seen in Europe and North America. And that's something to think about if you're contemplating the future, where the international community is bigger than just a bunch of countries in Europe and US plus Canada and maybe some, Japan, like South Korea and Australia, and that's it. So you need to think about it, like how is this possible that this massive, brutal, unprovoked war for no reason launched by Russia, basically annihilation war in many ways, how come it doesn't cut a reaction, strong reaction, negative reaction with many countries in the world? And finally, about the international organizations like NATO, that's a big deal, and Paula has addressed this issue. What is happening for NATO, obviously, 2014 has been a wake-up moment in many ways, and I remember people were saying, let's erect a little monument to Putin outside of headquarters. But this time around, maybe the bigger monument is in order or something. But seriously speaking, of course, NATO has been reminded by this brutal war what it was all about. I mean, all of the doubts, and if anyone had any doubts about whether NATO should be still there in business, I don't think these doubts are relevant anymore. The European Union is, interestingly enough, actually is working really actively to help Ukraine and punish Russia, and have done a bunch of packages of sanctions. And that's an interesting comparison. The other day, I'm not necessarily agreeing, but the other day there was an interview by Foreign Minister Kuleba here, Dmytro Kuleba, and he was praising European Union actually for their reaction and very critical of NATO reaction. He contrasted the assistance coming from particular member states within NATO to Ukraine, and he was very grateful to those who are doing this. But in terms of an alliance, he said basically there was no reaction. So it was an interesting discussion to be had. I think he's wrong. I think that the sum of the policy of NATO is policy of its member states, after all, to me. So if General Secretary or something hasn't made a strong enough sounds in support of Ukraine, then it's not a big deal. If you have absolute majority of the countries within the alliance helping Ukraine, so that's what counts. And most finally, I think that we're seeing here that the agency international affairs can be fought for. In case of Ukraine, there is a country which is smaller, and there is a country which is medium-sized country, which was a lot of people tried to decide its future over Ukrainians' heads, and it's not working out. You see someone like Ukraine reclaiming initiative, refusing to go under, and that's something that needs to be talked to also, I think, in a longer run. What about the country if you have all these intelligence agencies saying they're going to fall within days, and they're fighting really well. I mean, in 3 months later, of course, with all the Western support, but maybe there's something there. And Ukraine has this newly found confidence there with military, with civil society, with political elites even. So therefore, people are saying, no, we would decide actually the future of this country by, first of all, fighting Russians on the front line and then further on. So it's resilience of intuition, so to speak. It's really a clear case of resilience. But the longer-term security, there are still three main tracks, I think. One is for Ukraine to return to this idea of someday in the future to become part of Nato and therefore part of collective security arrangement. Another one is to try and hope that some sort of bunch of security guarantees coming from particular countries to Ukraine will work better than the last time, than this time. But I personally can say it frankly, that I don't believe in this. I'm very skeptical of those guarantees. I think that what we are so far hearing is not much better than the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. It's even more vague, if you like, the assurances and guarantees that we're hearing about these days. And the countries who are actually capable of maybe providing some viable security guarantees, like United Kingdom, like United States, and other countries, they're not rushing to give those to Ukraine because they understand the degree of responsibility that they would take on themselves if they actually sign up to such guarantees. So the final track, therefore, is some kind of a militarization of Ukraine. So basically building up on successes of our military right now, making it bigger, better funded, with better weapons provided by allies from the West, and therefore being ready to withstand and fight back any Russian aggression in the future. The military has got much stronger, as you can see, since 2014. It could be even stronger. So that might be still the next war with Russia might still be an asymmetric conflict because Russia is, after all, still bigger than us and has more resources. But it will be less asymmetric, and Ukraine will be better ready the next time around. So this militarization of Ukraine does have its potential minuses and negative features, because, for instance, if you put a lot of money into the military, it means you are basically taking some money away from like healthcare or education, or it might be even detrimental to Ukraine's democratic nature for that sense, because if you turn the country in a big military camp, that could be dangerous for the inherent, perhaps sometimes messy and imperfect, but inherent democracy that we have here in place. But that's a track to be explored, and in my view, it's basically the most realistic way ahead. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Volodya. So let's move to our panelists here at the table in Athens. We have four distinguished experts, each also representing a different institution and also a geographic provenance here. So we'll just go in the order of the program. First up, with his reactions to both the previous comments and the topic at large, James Nixie, who is the director of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House in London.
Thanks very much, Alex. Oh, not good. Right. Evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. First time in 22 years I've ever spoken professionally in Athens, and I've got lots of friends and colleagues here, so it's a real honour, even if I'm not doing it right. I think I'm okay now. Is that okay? All right. So, where shall I start? I'll talk a little bit about the war and the Western response and go through some scenarios and some fears and some outcomes. Well, look, Vladimir Putin is now officially in charge of this war. He's put his name to it, and that means that he's not going to back off. I'm afraid this will carry on. Much, of course, now depends upon the progress the two sides make over the coming weeks as they slug it out. That said, I don't necessarily believe in the idea of a long war of attrition, partly because of the economic realities which will set into Russia at the end of the summer, beginning of autumn, maybe a little bit later at worst. And I think it's very hard if Russia doesn't have access to capital markets and it's going to default on its debt and it can't borrow, etc., 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 for it to be able to keep funding its military machine. So I do think if the Ukrainians can hold out a little bit longer and keep on defending themselves and incidentally defending us as well, they're defending not just Ukraine, but they're defending Western democracy, let's face it, then actually I'm actually one of the optimists in this horrific war. Just another couple of points on that. I do think we've made some mistakes. I mean, the intelligence disclosures before the war were very interesting, a totally new thing that was tried. But I suppose it did invite Vladimir Putin to believe that he could do it with few costs. And on that topic, if we assume that Vladimir Putin was acting on a misguided understanding of what would happen, then it's probably fair to say that he's not exactly getting an accurate picture now either. So he may assume, it would be reasonable for him to assume, therefore, that he can outlive this Ukraine war. Personally, I worry far more about the West's response and the West's commitment than I do about Ukraine's ability to defend itself and us, as I say. Never underestimate the propensity of people and governments to want to move on and forget. Ukraine fatigue was real back in 2014. It was prevented a little bit by MH17, but then we got back into it. The days of, I don't know, Yuri Skripal and everyone was outraged for weeks but no more than weeks, and then there was this desire to get back to business as usual. Or, to put it another way, in some cases, some people say, put it slightly, park Russia, deal with China. I'm not really going to talk about Russia-China, but it's certainly there. So I worry also because of recent history that Ukraine will get pushed into something that is not into his interests, pushed into making dangerous decisions. We saw it in 2008 in Georgia. Is my microphone still okay? It feels a bit weird, but okay. I'll just carry on until someone stops me. They get pushed into making these decisions. It happened in 2008 in Georgia, and really, the Minsk deal was effectively written in Moscow as well. That was very much won in Russia's favor. So I think, the problem I see, I suppose, is that some in the West understand it as what it is, a war, but others, I think, still see it as a kind of a crisis management paradigm, something that can be managed. Lloyd Austin actually did this. I mean, it was quite interesting over there. He made a very strong statement, and then just a day later, as I recall, he made an appeal to Sergei Shoigu for a ceasefire, leaving territory in Russian hands. The worst things to do. So I think there are a lot of people we need to convince. A lot of Germans out there, a lot of French, perhaps, maybe a lot of Greeks. I don't know this country that well professionally, but it seems to me that a lot of people need convincing that the days of Thucydides and great powers being able to lord it over smaller powers are over. I mean, we started off with 141 members of the UN objecting to Russia's actions, calling out Russia's actions, and I feel we're quite a long way from that. And I think the danger, therefore, is that this will be seen in time as a Western-led war, and that the problems that we see with, food supply or grain and other issues like that are not because of Western sanctions, but obviously we ought to know that they're actually because of Russia's blockade of the Black Sea, effectively. My point I'm trying to make is that this isn't seen everywhere as we do. So I think there are ways in which we can respond to this, and they're quite extreme at the ends. There's obviously the accommodationist scenario, if you like, where we define our interest as being to find this negotiated settlement, to normalize relations with Russia and return Russia to, hopefully, this prolonged period of peace, stability and security. But that would be giving Russia pretty much all of it once for Christmas. That's the appeasement scenario, effectively. The second scenario, a little bit harder than that, is defining our interest. Our interest is being in the defense of Ukraine's scenario, but not shouting too loudly about it. It's in a largely declaratory fashion. We're content to let others make the running, perhaps, and not too strong sanctions. This is the story of the Western attitude towards Russia between 2014 and 22. I think, especially for my country, the UK, by the way. Scenario 3, I say, is in terms of what we should probably where I would be, I suppose, is that The West is unequivocal in its support for Ukraine's sovereignty, not more Ukrainian than Ukrainians, but at least as Ukrainian as the Ukrainians, and insists that it is for Ukraine to decide when to negotiate, to set its negotiating objectives, and to lead, and is in the lead in providing and coordinating, comprehensive support for Ukraine until such time as Russia is prepared to deal with Ukraine as a sovereign equal. And then I suppose the more extreme scenario after that one is where you're going a little bit beyond that, and you're talking about pushing for regime change, and you're trying to, and you're going the extra one there. That's. I think all of these scenarios are worth discussing. It's neglectful not to, but I would probably go for number 3 there for what it's worth. In the longer term, I can see Alex looking at me, so I'll stop very, very quickly. I think the outcome of this war is going to have a spectacular effect on the region. I mean, unprecedented. And I do mean the region. Russia's future will be decided in Ukraine. Ukraine's future will be decided in Ukraine. Probably true for Central Asia, Moldova, South Caucasus as well. So we should really brace ourselves for something major happening in time. I doubt that Vladimir Putin will be there in 5 years' time, and I don't know, but we should ask ourselves, therefore, what kind of Russia it is that we want to be dealing with, because this is a long-term problem. Putinism won't finish with Putin, I presume, and the next person along is hardly likely to be a sort of a nice, cozy liberal. That they don't really exist in the high echelons of Russian power, so it's a long-term problem. I was going to say a little bit about the nuclear thing and about outcomes, but you know what? I think I'm probably out of time, so I'll save it for everyone's sakes.
Thanks, James. So you covered a lot of territory already. Our next panelist is Olga Oliker from Brussels. She is the program. She's not from Brussels, but she's joining us, living in Brussels. She is Program Director for Europe and Central Asia at the International Crisis Group, and before that, with extensive experience in Washington, D.C. and the American think tank community. So, Olga, welcome, and we're interested in your thoughts about this important topic.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for being here and for having me. So I want to talk a little bit about expectations, a little bit about deterrence, and a little bit about what comes next, where my scenarios overlap with James's, but I think his were more kind of options or goals, and mine are more, or at least I'm trying to at least lay them out more as scenarios, and I'll try to do all that in 5 minutes. So I'll talk very fast. I won't. So expectations. A year ago, which was probably 17 years ago in subjective time, what we expected in Europe was continuing conventional tension with a lot of exercises, military buildups between NATO member states on the one hand and Russia, possibly with Belarus on the other, intended as deterrence on both sides, right? Both parties trying to deter the other from things that they didn't want them to do. Various discussions on nuclear arms control between Russia and the United States mainly, but positions very far apart. The emphasis overall was on deterrence of the other, on avoiding being deterred from doing anything oneself, and assuming that deterrence would work and things would kind of stay that way for a pretty long time. By the end of last year and into February, we had this buildup on the borders of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. And there was some discussion as to whether that might mean some kind of Russian military action in Ukraine and what that would be. But there was also a notion that the crisis might be an opportunity to actually rethink security on the continent, that the idea behind what a lot of Western officials went to Moscow with or talked to the Russians with was, okay, you know what, maybe deterrence is kind of scary, maybe models where we're just trying to freak each other out aren't the best idea. Let's talk about how we could calm things down a little bit. Let's talk about bringing back conventional arms control. Let's talk about limiting exercises. And then the Russians went ahead and launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. On February 25th of this year, what most people expected was a rapid Russian victory followed by armed camps, large-scale buildups, and a deterrence-focused security structure. Lose Ukraine from the perspective of the West, gain Ukraine from the perspective of Russia, and build up on that basis, and then wait for the really super dangerous next crisis, for those who are thinking that far ahead, because the next time Russia did something, whether in Ukraine or somewhere else, or in Georgia or wherever else, everybody would be kicking themselves for not having done enough in 2022 and would then be motivated to escalate further. So what happened instead? Well, what happened instead was that the Russians got bogged down in Ukraine by the fact that they did not, the Ukrainians resisted far harder than anyone, possibly including the Ukrainians, expected them to. And the West started supplying them with weapons, which kept that resistance going. So I want to start off by saying, what did we learn about deterrence from all of this? Because I think that's really interesting, because deterrence has remained such an important factor in the way we look at European security. So one thing we've learned is that deterrence works. NATO has, but not always the way you want it to. NATO has avoided direct involvement in this war, and Russia has not attacked NATO members because both are deterred by the fear of greater escalation, right? Both are deterred by the threat of nuclear war, NATO from being more direct in its involvement, Russia from attacking NATO members because they fear nuclear war. We've also learned that deterrence doesn't always work. It only works when threats are credible. And the short of that, countries are pretty much willing to test their luck. So deterrence failed Western states when they made their case that Russia shouldn't launch a full-scale war. Russia just wasn't scared enough. Why not? Well, didn't expect the response that it actually in the end got, maybe. But arguably, neither did NATO and EU members expect the response that they provided, which is actually a huge deterrence failure, right? Strategic ambiguity is great when you can convince your adversary you're going to do more than you're actually going to do. It's terrible when you've convinced your adversary you're going to do less. That is a failure of deterrence. Deterrence failed Russia when they tried saber-rattling about helping Ukraine. When they told NATO, ooh, terrible things will happen if you continue to help Ukraine. NATO member states were like, no, don't believe you. And they were right not to. Terrible things did not, in fact, happen, though now you're seeing that help and support creeping up over time. The other interesting thing that we've learned is that both the threats and the red lines are mutable. They change over time, and that makes things inherently unstable. And it's a built-in ambiguity, and it can lead you to underestimate or overestimate, which you'd like people to do for deterrence, but it can also lead you to underestimate the risk and have more deterrence failures. Very quickly, what could happen next? So Ukrainian collapse, the scenario we expected, most of us, as of February 24th, 25th, seems really unlikely. And yet, the scenario of buildups seems still pretty likely. I mean, that's a lot of what Paula was just describing. So how could that happen? I mean, one option is you get a ceasefire and a deal with a contrite Russia to which the West dictates terms. Then it's only the West building up, but probably it's still building up, at least to some extent, and trying to force feed something to Russia. I mean, this is actually not 100% clear how this scenario works. What the theory of victory and change is for getting here, or the logic of what you do with a Russia under these conditions. A ceasefire and agreement with a frustrated Russia and Ukraine, this is James's dangerous decision, where they make a deal neither of them is happy with, is inherently an unstable deal, right? And there you do get to kind of what we were expecting before, the buildup of armed camps, but with Ukraine more or less in the Western camp. But you're still really in trouble if there's a new crisis. This could be more sustainable if it's rooted in a broader set of arms control deals, but that's really unlikely to happen because there's not going to be much appetite for that. Continued war, I tend to agree with James, isn't very likely, but it's possible. I think that still leads to the armed camps model if there's a continued war. So you're still in kind of that same situation. And then with that comes the risk of escalated war. And I think that a continued war does increase those risks because the buildup of NATO support for Ukraine is going to continue and it's going to be more likely. The Russians' willingness to take risks may be higher over time. So I think the danger of escalation, the one that we otherwise get to save for the next crisis, is going to be built into this one if the war continues, which might be kind of an obvious point, but I think it's one that's worth remembering as things are getting more dangerous, not less dangerous, and not just to the folks in eastern Ukraine who are currently under fire.
Olga, thank you very much. So after two prominent think tankers and policy institutes, we have two distinguished academics who are also policy commentators, Professor Konstantinos Filis, who's the director and associate professor Institute of Global Affairs, the American College of Greece. Please.
Thank you. Well, I was thinking of speaking on the same lines with the previous speakers, but I was asked by one of the organizers to focus on Greek-Russian relations and what is the impact of this war on Greek-Russian relations. So I will start by saying that from the outset, Greece has maintained a principled stance against the Russian invasion, considering a number of factors, including the perceptions and methods shared by Russia and Turkey. We have always an eye to Turkey, of course. While other countries have helped Kiev more and more substantially, we see that Moscow has taken aim at Athens. At a time when Russia is seeking support in the West, it is to be expected that it will address Greek society, invoking our historical, cultural, and religious ties to create rifts, hoping that the Greek government takes these reactions into account and moderates its identification with the US in this war. In fact, in order to promote its propaganda messages, the Kremlin is investing in forces that have common ground with Russia and are pushing back against the current policy. And in fact, according to surveys to date, it appears that a significant percentage of Greeks, which is fortunately failing over time, I have to stress, has a different take on our position vis-à-vis Moscow. In any case, Russia constantly refers to the ties between our two peoples in order to influence public opinion and highlight the distance between public opinion and government policy. This situation could be capitalized on later with a more active involvement of Russian-controlled elements in domestic politics and/or the critical upcoming elections, which will employ the proportional representation system so that even candidates who win in a much smaller percentage of the vote could play a role in developments. So in this sense, and in addition to showing that Athens is not backing down in the face of public opinion and has chosen to align itself with the West, the expulsion of 12 Russian diplomats was a warning to Moscow not to meddle in our domestic affairs. Now, returning to our stance, this can also be explained from the perspective liberal order struggle against authoritarians, as well as protection of borders, sovereignty, and territorial integrity against hostile invading forces and revisionists. It is also clear that Greece sees similarities between Russia's invoking protection of minorities and Ankara's rhetoric along the same lines, calling Greece's Muslim minority in Thrace Turkish. Just as we see similarities between a large neighbor's invasion of a smaller one, the occupation of territory, with Moscow invoking security and styling itself as a guarantor, and the Turkish invasion and illegal occupation of a portion of Cyprus. And the environment may not allow for any aggressive action on the part of Turkey right now, but Greece sees it as important in a time of structural changes in the international system to stand by those who are trying to save democracy. And it is clear which camp Athens and Ankara belong to. Second, at a stage in modern history when rule of law is losing ground globally, and not just by Russia's hand, we have to admit, it is of decisive importance to Greece that a new and specific framework of rules and norms be agreed upon and consolidated, a framework that will also cover Turkey's conduct. Still, we can see, mainly in the relative rewarming of US-Turkish relations, that consistency and the principled stance aren't always rewarded, and nor is irresponsible and counterproductive behavior appropriately punished. However, because as a country we are very different from Turkey, we understandably prioritize a stance of responsibility and reliability on the Ukraine issue. And allow me here to underscore something. It is clear that we must not end up being taken for granted by our partners, because there is a risk of the value attached to us shrinking if our partners think we will fall into line with them, whatever the case. But I believe that there is room for Greece to become a counterweight to Russia in the exercise of our foreign policy, or for Russia to become a counterweight for us, as it was attempted in 2015, under more favorable conditions in our bilateral relations, is, to put it bluntly, silly. Beyond the mutual distrust, the rift caused by the Prespa agreement between Athens and Moscow, the falling out between the ecumenical patriarchate and the Moscow patriarchate, Russia's conviction that Greece is acting on behalf of the US, even more so after the agreement for the creation of a base in Alexandroupolis, the functional relationship between Russia and Turkey. For some time now, we have been moving in the opposite direction from Russia, and we disagree on more issues than we agree on. And beyond that, the Greek government is right in intending to seek investigation of the war crimes in Mariupol, all the more so given the historical presence of Greeks in the region. And one last thing, we will obviously exhaust our options for averting actions that harm our interests regarding issues of critical importance, such as the Cyprus issue and Greek-Turkish relations. And Russia's tourism footprint, by the way, is small, in contrast to what many believe, and the damage is certainly manageable. The same holds true in the energy sector. Even in the worst-case scenario, having reduced our independence on Russian natural gas from 68% in 2012 to under 40% today, and thanks to LNG infrastructure, we can weather the crisis. So the obvious question, and I'm going to close with that, is whether from here on, Russia's footholds in Greece, developed mainly in northern Greece, through church circles specifically, will erode or prove durable now that they're on rather than under the Greek state's radars. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And next, and our final panelist is Professor Julie Newton, who is director of the University Consortium. She's a visiting fellow. She's based out of the University of Oxford at St. Anthony's College.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everybody, for this is wonderful to have so many different views. And I am going to add a slightly academic view, but one that I hope is policy related. And as Volodymyr said, and I love his phrase, this is Putin's annihilation war. Putin alone, of course, made this terrible decision, and he alone is responsible for it. And I think James is really interesting the way he mentioned the different ways of understanding the nature of this war, that some referred to it as a proper war between Russia and Ukraine, whereas Lloyd Austin mentioned it as, I think you said, a crisis management of some nature. I'm increasingly concerned, however, by mainstream tendencies on both sides of this divide, of this war, to frame this confrontation as a sweeping ideological struggle. I'm concerned by the essentialization of this conflict, as the word goes. In other words, many are now referring to it as an essential struggle between authoritarianism on one side and democracy on the other. Even Andrei Kortunov, a nuanced Russian expert who is the head of the Russian International Affairs Council, wrote in this week's Economist that this is a struggle between two different socio-political models. Now, it may be becoming an all-encompassing ideological struggle today, and I think, as Konstantinos just said, certainly rule of law and democracy are increasingly at stake. But there's little evidence to suggest that it started out this way 20, 25 years ago as a sweeping struggle of this essential nature. Because if we unpack the factors that shape Russian and even more so than Chinese authoritarianism, surely insecurity and suspicion, a sense of threats, are extremely important, if they're not, of course, the entire story, as some would say. I don't argue that their entire story, but certainly security issues are important. I mean, internationally, Russia has always suffered perennially from security dilemmas, as well as from image and status ambitions and anxieties. And Russian preoccupation with security and threats, both internal and external, go back for centuries, not just with Putin. And an explanation of the origins of this confrontation as an ideological sweeping struggle, it misses the more complex, contingent, or contextual drivers of confrontation before February 24th, even before, I would argue, 2014. And those kinds of drivers including security dilemmas on all sides, misaligned interests, perceptions, misperceptions, cultural particularities, emotions, and of course the ongoing consequences of the Soviet collapse, which has gone on for 30 years. These are factors that are very much part of the explanation for how Russia and the West fell into profound confrontation by 2014. So why does it matter? Why does it matter how we frame the nature of the struggle between Russia and the West? Why does that count? It matters because the way we diagnose this problem from the beginning, before February 24th, informs the kinds of policies we prescribe even today. Because diagnosing this conflict even before the war started as a black and white maximalist struggle between two socioeconomic political orders has three policy-related problems, in my view. First, it makes us prescribe maximalist policy prescriptions that are, quite frankly, unlikely to work. We hear a lot of Russia must be isolated, humiliated until Putin is gone. Well, of course, these are morally virtuous and totally understandable approaches, and I feel the same way. But practically speaking, it's hard to see how this approach is going to advance any progress towards our preferences after the war for some kind of peaceful coexistence. The second is that humiliation and total isolation at least for after a certain period, could easily stoke World War I type revenge tendencies in Russia for the long term. It's hard to see a liberal order coming back into Russia after the regime change scenario that James describes in these circumstances when Russia has been so humiliated, especially as the Russian economy continues to deteriorate. Because as we know from history, rabid ethnic nationalism flourishes in such circumstances of humiliation combined with economic collapse. The third reason why I'm worried about this kind of maximalist framing of this conflict is because of the risks of escalation. I mean, framing the war in these terms as an ideological struggle with maximalist humiliation more easily enlarges this war into one between US and NATO on one side and Russia on the other. And we heard Paula saying how NATO is struggling to try and avoid this kind of escalation at this level. And that increases escalation to the risks of nuclear war, the collapse of deterrence that Olya mentioned. If Russia already feels it's in a war with NATO, it will be even more tempted to use a nuclear weapon or the kind of loose the situation of nuclear pressure. It'll feel even more pressure to use it because NATO is conventionally so much stronger than Russia. So instead, I think we need to think about three things, at least for the short term. Avoid more this kind of maximalist talk of framing it as this kind of larger, sweeping confrontation, because and that exacerbates the situation to prompt Putin to escalate and prompts Putin into more emotional recklessness. So we need to avoid the kind of references to pushing for regime change. The kind of war crimes tribunal talk doesn't necessarily help, even though it's completely true and understandable. This talk of weakening Russia, I mean, rhetoric matters on all sides. It also strengthens Russia's society, self-perception as a threatened, besieged fortress. And we see already that there's an increasing rally around the flag effect among some Russians who originally were against the war. Second, I think we need, obviously we need to allow Ukraine to defend itself, and we need to give as much effort as we can to that defense to push back at Russia. As Paula said, I agree with her that we cannot engage in meaningful dialogue right now. But sooner rather than later, at some point, when the timing is right, we are going to need to try and bring this war to a close. Why? For three reasons again. First, as Olga said, the risks of escalation, inadvertent or perhaps deliberate, are growing every day the longer this war goes on. Perhaps Olga and James are right that maybe this will not become a war of attrition, but nobody can guarantee that. Stalemate is increasingly possible in some ways because it's going to get harder for Ukraine as Ukraine turns more to offensive positions. Second, I think we need to Consider the blowback from this war for the world, for the global south, with famine and food shortages everywhere, and the stakes are just too high to let it go on and on. And third, and finally, I think we need to consider the risks of ongoing unity. How do we sustain the kind of unity that Volodymyr said was so surprising to him and to all of us? Over time, I'm fearful, as James also said, that this unity is going to unravel. So finally, to conclude, I do think we need to have some careful thinking about the peace that will come, that needs to come afterwards. And to quote, I think in this NATO conference, George Robertson, the former Secretary General of NATO, who said last week at Oxford, the highest level of grand strategy is to conduct war with regard to the peace that will come afterwards. I realize it is too soon to talk about peace. I understand that we cannot take away from Ukraine the need to make maximum effort, but nevertheless, the talk of peace and negotiation is surprisingly minimal. And I think it's at least while we think about that we cannot engage with Russia at the moment, we need to think about sooner rather than later how and when. And with that, I close.
Okay, thanks very much, Julie. I would now like to go back to Volodymyr and Paula and for their reactions to the panelists, and perhaps you can pick one or two main points that you'd like to sort of respond to after those round of comments. So Volodymyr, let's start with you.
Well, I saw a lot of consensus really among the speakers, and that's hardly surprising. I want to use the opportunity as well to thank everyone who is Greek in this audience, and I see there are many Greeks in the audience, for your assistance and your support and moral support, and even goes even bigger, even greater lengths than sending weapons or money to Ukraine. I mean, to Ukraine in this time of need. We really need to know that we are not abandoned, we're not forgotten, that people feel our pain, and that's still very important for us here in Ukraine. I mean, we're stuck with this massive invasion, but helping us, and Greeks have been helping us in many ways, in numerous ways, is really helpful. In terms of how this war ends, I think we don't know still yet. We probably should start thinking about it, but we don't have the counters yet, or the outlines, the sketches of how it will end. I'm afraid there will be more fighting needed, and it's felt by both sides here, before it comes to some negotiation. Both sides, it seems, they're not liking their current negotiating position. They want to improve on it before they sit down. In Ukraine, several things happened since Istanbul round of negotiations, which really hardened Kyiv's position. One thing was obviously some successes of the Ukrainian military, including some counteroffensives here and there. Second thing was that people really were emboldened and confident, with maybe hoping to liberate Ukraine by force. Another thing is Bucha happened. Many Buchas happened, and therefore people are really incensed and angered here. So whatever appetite was here for some kind of negotiation and concessions is gone. I mean, the dominating figure. I mean, we have many feelings here. It's terror, it's fear, it's sadness, and so on. But the dominating one is anger. I mean, it's really prevailing feeling right now here in Ukraine, still is. And therefore, Ukraine, of course, is not Russia. In Russia, one guy makes all decisions, even stupid ones. In Ukraine, Zelensky, with all his rock star kind of popularity these days, he is still a leader in a democratic country. He needs to deal with the parliament, with opposition, with public, with all those things, with military, which is tired of fighting this war. We have huge losses, obviously. We're not revealing them, but they are big. We understand that. But at the same time, this military wouldn't be looking lightly if the president would concede too much. They would say, like, okay, but why we fought so hard for those 3 months for him to give to a war that Russia was too many things. So I mean, therefore, in Ukraine here, there is no impetus at all. There is no feeling in the air that we need to sit down. Even though Zelensky is cautious, and he's speaking the other day, I think yesterday, he actually said that we're only thinking about so far about returning to the borders of pre-February 24th, not more. All right, so calming down everyone and cooling cats around, who already speaking about Donbass and Crimea, included here in the Ukraine's liberation as well. He's saying, okay, we're paying huge price every day. We're losing guys and so on. And I met a number of people who lost their loved ones on the front line here. So it's very personal. This war is very personal in Ukraine, as it always was comparing to Russia, because in Russia, of course, everything is hidden, was since 2014. Here you have this interviews, you have these pictures, you have these photos, you have these people who are related to those who were killed in the war. So it's very, very personal, and therefore, of course, there is this limit on the pain that we can receive, and Russia obviously is using this, trying to inflict the maximum of pain, and yet Ukraine is still not there. We're still not willing to just go under and concede, and right now there is still the fighting spirit which is prevailing here in this country.
Thank you, Volodymyr. Paula.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a fascinating discussion. I was actually taking notes. I don't know if you saw me for my own. Just two quick things on Julia's presentation. In general, and whether we frame it or not in terms of ideology, the war, I think what we are seeing is definitely a war between a democracy and an autocracy, and we are seeing it also in the ways that the things are going in the battlefield and the way decisions are making. I think a lot of people in the West always thought that autocracies are the ones that can win wars and they can take quickly decisions and they are not entangled in democratic processes. And what we are seeing here is that Ukraine actually is doing well and doing better because it's a democracy and it has check and balances in their government, because there was someone who can advise the president and is not in fear of being fired. And this is what we actually saw I imagine, and I think what most of the experts that follow Russian politics imagine that happened. Like someone came up with an idea, that someone probably being the president, and no one could actually respond to him or criticize his decision. And probably the fact that there is no free media, there are no check and balance in the society, there is not a dialogue. And this is also what Volodymyr was saying. They were able to hide everything from the Russian public and create this propaganda machine. So that's one point. That doesn't mean that I disagree with you. I just wanted to follow on your presentation. That was actually very, very interesting. And then the other point that I have is that I think NATO will stand with Ukraine, and I think in all our communiques and after the ministerial, we have said that we have agreed to continue supporting Ukraine for as long as necessary, so Ukraine can prevail, because I think it's also up to the Ukrainian people. And I don't know if we talk a lot about it, but the President Putin is actually paying a high price for this war. And this is not necessarily our fault that he's paying this high price. Was something out of his making. He has destroyed decades of economic progress for the Russian people on his own. It has not been us destroying that. He decided to go into Ukraine, and he is destroying the Russian economy and the prospect for Russian people. So in a way, he's humiliating himself, if I can put it that way. So yeah, those are my points of the presentations.
Thanks so much. So it wouldn't be a hybrid event without getting to some questions from the audience members, but we are short on time, so I'm just going to ask, let's take 2 or 3 questions. Try and keep them brief, and tell us who you are by way of introduction, and we'll come back for panel answers. Yep. Please, Dimitri.
Dimitri Triantafilou from Kadir Has University in Istanbul. Very interesting discussion, but I want to widen the scope a little bit. Julie has tried to do this, but let's bring in a little bit, some of the consequences. So you had Macron on May 9th talk about the creation of a European political community. Charles Michel on May 18th talked about a European geopolitical community right before he went to the Balkans. And one of the consequences of the war is this whole thing about this process of dual enlargement right now, right? NATO on the one hand with Sweden and Finland wanting to join, and also states such as the Western Balkan states concerned that they're being left out because the new darling is Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova and so on. And so there are wider consequences to this war that need to be considered and factored in. And this would be interesting because, it's interesting the point about, yes, the moral support of Ukraine is there, undeniable, we all support this, well, moral support does not have to be material support per se. I mean, we're denigrating the argument of those opposed or those coming up with arguments about stopping the war now with Ukraine ceding territory. It's not just that. It's much more than that, because there's a real fear in Europe about...
I'm going to have to push you.
Right. Right,
Because
about
we wanna
the
get another-
Ukrainization of European foreign policy, right? I mean, and so how do we deal with this? Is just something I'm just putting out there, because
Great.
all these issues come out of the war and the consequences.
Yes, they are. Yep, perfect. Yes, I think there's a hand back there. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron Bell. I'm a researcher here at EDIS. The question is for the resident Greek on the panel, so Professor Philis, please. On the one hand, we have the Greek Prime Minister go to the United States and make it very clear to the world that Greece is 100% behind Ukraine. On the other hand, we have a situation where 1 out of every 2 vessels carrying Russian energy products is owned or managed by a Greek ship owner. What is going on?
Okay. So those are 2, I think, really substantive issues. I would say let's go in the order of the table, since the question came about Greece transporting oil. So let's start with Professor Philis, and then we'll move over here. And 1 minute each, please.
Okay. I'll take 50 seconds to reply to what Dimitris said, and only 10 seconds to reply to the question addressed to me, simply because it's, money talking here. So the Greek government can do nothing to control or stop Greek ship owners from doing business. We're talking about free trade, so maybe there is a moral issue arising, but rather than that, there is nothing exceptional in practical terms that we can do on our behalf. And I don't think that any other government would have done something different if it were in our position. But we can discuss about that in detail afterwards. Regarding Dimitris' question, very brief comment. The West attempts to show a united front against Russia, and it has managed to do this to a large extent, but the different intensity of the repercussions for Europe and the United States is obvious, and that affects European policy. For us, Russia, as you know, the Europeans, is our first energy supplier. For the US, Russia has a very small footprint in the US energy market, if at all. And for the European Union, it's the 5th largest trade partner. And for the United States, it's the 26th largest trade partner. So this different intensity of the repercussions, to an extent, impacts, to a big extent, impacts European policy. And let me stress here a paradox. On the one hand, we Europeans, European citizens, ask our governments and our leaders to do anything at their disposal to stop Putin from continuing with this brutal war. On the other hand, we do not want the effects or the impact of these measures, sanctions taken against Russia, to have an effect in our pockets. So it's a paradox here that, at least for now, we cannot solve and find, the right mix of policy to be able to tackle this challenge.
Thank you. And a paradox felt in other countries too. Hold on.
So another paradox, actually 2 paradoxes. One is an American talking about EU enlargement, and the second is what I'm actually going to say about it. So, it's an interest, the Ukraine crisis has brought to the forefront these questions of EU enlargement that are very awkward and very difficult to manage. This desire to give the Ukrainians something, which preferably isn't NATO membership. Hey, I know, let's give them EU membership. Oh, wait, there are all these countries that have lived through their own horrific wars that have been waiting in the wings for EU membership and haven't gotten it. Why haven't they? Oh, because they haven't met conditions for EU membership. There's this fundamental, this is the fundamental paradox for enlargement to Ukraine, which is that the Ukrainian desire to join the European Union is primarily geostrategic. It's not really about the institutions and the institutional requirements. Yes, they're willing to do that in order to join. However, if a country does join the EU without having met the institutional requirements, what the EU has learned from experience is it weakens the EU, and it makes it much more difficult for it to be the institution that is useful both geostrategically and economically to its existing member states. Where this has left me is far more sympathetic to creative stopgap solutions than I used to be, of sort of circles of association and so forth. I don't know that this solves the problem, but it does help kick the problem down the road. I think in the end, fundamentally, it will be very bad for the European Union if it enlarges by lowering requirements. So, this is the only way I see forward in the near term.
Great. Professor Newton.
Yes, Paula, I enjoyed your comment. Thank you for making that comment. And I totally agree with you. The fact that Ukraine is doing so well precisely because it is more of a democracy. It's more of a horizontal society as part of its strength, for sure. My only point is that by focusing on this confrontation today as a sweeping ideological struggle disguises the original mixture of Russian grievances with a complex of causes that will still be there when this war is over. And it makes us ignore those drivers that are going to continue to fester.
Great, thank you. And James, you get the final word.
Lucky me. I think, just in response to Julie there, absolutely Russia's had grievances. I would just argue that they're almost all illegitimate and unacceptable grievances.
We can
so
argue
I know,
about
of
that.
course. So, Dimitri, look, I mean, President Macron is a conviction-based politician. He's not an evidence-based politician. He has a goal in mind, and no matter how many times he returns to the well, like some abused partner, the abuser being Putin, of course, he just can't give up, it seems to me. We need an outcome whereby Ukraine is in the best possible position at the end of this, whilst also avoiding a third, and I do mean third, Russia-Ukraine war.
Well, I think you see there is plenty to keep discussing. We are so grateful to you, Volodymyr, for joining us. Thank you, my friend, for being here. Thank you to Paula for also joining us here. Thank you to all the panelists for you, and I suppose we will look to the next edition of the Athens Security Forum, again, on behalf of the Institute of International Relations. Thank you. Bye-bye.